Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Osterman. I'm the Principal Analyst with Osterman Research, and I'm here today with Greg Mooney, who I'll introduce in just a moment. Welcome to our webinar, Staying Compliant in a Work-from-Home World. Just a little bit about Osterman Research so you get our perspective in all of this. We're an independent market research and consulting firm, and our focus is on really how people communicate and collaborate in a workplace context. We focus very heavily on things like compliance, security, archiving, authentication, basically any of the technologies and processes that are necessary to enable people to communicate or collaborate effectively. We have a very strong emphasis on primary research. We're going to be going through the results of a survey that was completed just last week. The company's about 19 years old, and we're located in Western Washington. So we'd like to start out with a poll. We're going to do our first poll here, basically asking, do you care if employees practice safe cybersecurity practices when they are not at work? Just want to get your take on this. Answer yes or no, and we'll discuss that in just a moment. We'll leave just a few more seconds for that. Okay, and as you can see, not surprisingly, 100%, and not obviously not everybody voted, but we would expect, that the vast majority of people out there would care about employees, safe cybersecurity practices when they're not at work, and that's even more of an issue now in the suddenly work from home environment that we're seeing as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. So. Let's move on here. I mentioned we did a major survey of organizations that now have employees working from home, and we spoke to IT decision makers and influencers. Just wrapped up the survey last week, and what we found, not surprisingly, is that a huge number of employees are now working from home. We're finding that before the COVID-19 crisis, only 18% of employees were working from home, at least part-time. I mean, there are a lot of employees that are both in an office and work from home a couple of days a week. We find now that it's about 80% of employees that are working from home, and this is virtually full-time now because they can't go to an office in most cases. We found that about 5 out of 9 of the survey respondents are actually in a jurisdiction that's currently subject to some sort of a stay-at-home, shelter-in-place, or a similar type of order. And the proportion of employees working from home has increased, as you can see here, by more than 400% in the space of just about a month. And so we're looking at this enormous number of employees that are now suddenly working from home, most of whom probably never did except informally to bring work home from the office, that kind of thing. And at this point, I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Greg Mooney. Greg, introduce yourself, please, and what do you think about this? What do you think about this data?
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me join today, Mike. I hope everyone's safe and well out there. I'm Greg Mooney. I'm a IT and security evangelist at Progress. Kind of been doing data compliance and security with my customers and colleagues for a little over 6 years. I've kind of been I'm a former sysadmin, so I've been in the IT space for about a decade now. So definitely understand the challenges of moving to a work from home culture. Definitely when I was in IT, that was we rarely had anybody working from home. So I know this data, it makes a lot of sense to me, especially the IT professionals I've been working with, helping them stay secure and compliant over the past few months. And the conversations I've had, everyone's been pivoting the entire workforce from home. So yeah, it's definitely I know a lot of you have probably gone through a lot of the issues originally with getting people the hardware they need, making sure their home environments are set up so there's no issues with business continuity. But yeah, I think a lot of us probably have weathered that storm already. If not, you're probably still in the midst of it, or probably close to getting through that. But yeah, no, this data is exactly what I would expect, and I'm actually surprised it's not even higher than 80%. Maybe a lot of it, I bet those other industries are probably, why that's down to 80%, maybe like healthcare, essential workers, a lot of IT people probably have to have, for certain industries, probably still have to have staff on site. So that may be the 20% that we're not seeing.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, because there are still a lot of people going into a workplace, like you say, with essential workers that have to be there, that really can't do their work from home. And also, I mean, there are some even office workers that can go in. In Washington State, for example, you can go into your office even in what's called a non-essential business if you are managing workers working from home. So, there will be somebody there in IT to, make sure the servers are up and running, that kind of thing. So in that survey, we asked, about a variety of important issues. And we asked respondents, again, these are IT decision makers and influencers, we asked them to rate these things on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is, not concerned at all, no worries, 7 is extremely concerned. And what we're seeing here are the 6s and 7s. And what we're finding is that, there's obviously a lot of concern that hackers will try to take advantage of the COVID-19 crisis. They'll increase, the number of cyber attacks and so forth. And we've seen that. We've seen huge increases in the number of phishing attacks and ransomware attempts and that kind of thing. A lot of decision makers are concerned about employees, accidentally opening emails that contain ransomware, maybe some kind of a phishing attack, clicking on a link and so forth, or some other kind of email cyber attack. About a third are concerned really about the overall risk profile of the organization as a result of this whole crisis and the sudden growth of the remote workforce. And they should be concerned. I mean, there are, lots of employees that are now working from home that really never did before, and they don't have the appropriate infrastructure. We've seen cases where, there just aren't enough laptops to go around because employees were at work using a desktop. Now they don't have anything with all of the tools they need from home. And they're slowly getting that, but it does take some time. And then also concerns about risk of data loss because, communications are happening outside of normal channels. And also, as we'll get into here in just a bit, email and data backup and recovery are not really adequate for a remote workforce. We find that a lot of organizations are not archiving, they're not backing up their data as they were before. And so there's lots of corporate data that now is really not being protected as it was just a few weeks ago. So we're going to do another poll here. And we'd like to ask, which of the following has been the biggest issue for you while enabling a remote workforce? Is it data security, compliance, shadow IT, service level agreements, or is it software licensing? So we'll leave this up in just a few more seconds and just ask, what the biggest issue is for you. Okay, so let's end the poll and we'll share the results. Again, not many of you voting, but yeah, shadow IT is the number one concern, and not surprisingly, because we've been suddenly thrust into this work from home environment where there's loads of shadow IT out there, from desktop computers to personally owned laptops to personal mobile phones, and this caught a lot of IT decision makers off guard. They just, theoretically, they knew something like this could happen, but nobody really expected this to happen now. And Greg, wanted to get your take on this. What do you see as the biggest concerns around this work from home movement?
Yeah, I personally would have said data security is probably, the biggest issue I've heard, but obviously shadow IT kind of ties into, the data security and compliance aspects of that as well. From what I've been seeing, it's really, it's not as much of a mixed bag as I thought it was going to be. It's really, it's like you were saying before, people need to have the hardware and software capabilities that they would otherwise have in, when they're inside the office. Now that's not the case. So, a lot of people now are probably working from their own hardware, and that could be due to, the ergonomics of, their office or their home office or wherever they have to work since they can't go into the office. So, and, obviously, as I was saying before, you got the business continuity issues. If an employee doesn't have the ability to get their job done effectively and efficiently, and if there is kind of a breakdown in communication between IT and the end users, then a lot of your end users or employees, so to speak, they're gonna take matters into their own hands and try to alleviate those issues that they're having with business operations. So and I think you'll. And I'll go a little bit further into that in more detail later. But I think one of the biggest examples I can think of is, like video conferencing apps, and we've heard all about Zoom and Zoom bombing and stuff like that. If, so, for instance, like I use Skype, and we've had consistent issues with Skype, and it's silly because Microsoft has like multiple, video conferencing tools and collaboration tools in their ecosystem. So, you got Microsoft Teams, but then you got Skype. But if neither of those are working, then somebody's going to go out, everyone's hearing about these free trials for Zoom. Someone's going to go out and use Zoom without ITs knowing it. And we've heard about, the Zoom bombing, and, people hackers find ways to kind of sneak into people's video conferences. And if you're talking about sensitive business data, that's going to be a huge issue and a compliance issue, at least for your company, because you're going to be having conversations about sensitive subjects that you otherwise wouldn't want to get out into the public.
Yeah, very much so. And that's become a huge issue. And, obviously Zoom is aware of it and are trying to do things about it, but it's a problem for really a lot of the tools that are in use out there. So, as I mentioned, IT decision makers really weren't all that well prepared for this kind of eventuality where suddenly, over the space of like maybe 3 or 4 weeks, millions of workers now have to start working from home. And as you can see here, fewer than 1 in 5 really considered themselves to be quote unquote very well prepared, although another 32% said that we were pretty well prepared. So, they had most of the infrastructure in place. But we do find that there are still a lot of holes around security, archiving, backup. Only 57% of organizations in the survey have actually implemented new capabilities, things like VPNs or multi-factor authentication. So it's leaving, more than 2 in 5 organizations without these additional security controls for their employees working from home, and that is going to create a lot of issues around compliance and security and all the rest, as we'll get into here in just a bit. So, getting into compliance, it's become a critical business issue over the past 3 years, particularly with things like GDPR, with the California Consumer Privacy Act, the potentially upcoming New York Privacy Act, things in Colorado, Brazil, Australia, across the world. There's this whole movement toward privacy regulations. And really the pace of compliance is increasing. If you look at all of these regulations that are either proposed or have come online recently or have actually been around for quite a while, there are more and more compliance obligations, even in the United States, things like HIPAA and FERPA, and just lots of different privacy and compliance regulations that organizations are having to deal with. And one of the things we've found over time is that many industries, many organizations said, well, we're not really in a regulated space, so we don't have to worry about these compliance obligations. That's not really true anymore. Yes, you don't maybe have the strict obligations that the financial services industry has under SEC and FINRA. You don't have HIPAA to deal with if you're a healthcare provider or in the healthcare related industry, but everybody has to deal with things like GDPR and CCPA. You have some level of compliance obligation regardless of the organization you are, the size of organization you are, the industry you're in, and so forth. What we found in the survey also is that compliance is suffering. As I mentioned earlier, only 72% of the organizations we surveyed are actually backing up all the data as they were before the crisis began, and only 59% are archiving all data as they were before. And that's not really surprising when you've got a lot of employees working from home on their own laptops, their own desktop computers, using their own mobile phones. They're generating a lot of data that's not going into a central archive or a central backup. It's just sitting there on their home computer, potentially available to unauthorized parties. It's not being archived the way it should, and so forth. That is creating some enormous compliance problems that we'll see, in the months and years to follow when organizations are going into legal actions without all of their data. They're trying to satisfy GDPR or CCPA subject access requests without all of their data. That's going to be a huge issue. What we also found is when we asked IT decision makers, their agreement with, are you doing an excellent job at blocking security threats from impacting your organization? Before that, it was 56%. Not a great number, but still over half said we consider that we're doing an excellent job at security. Now it's only 49%. And while that doesn't seem like a huge number, that means there are millions of users that are really operating in a fairly unsecure manner. Same thing with maintaining compliance with various compliance obligations. Before that, 64% told us that, yeah, we're doing a very good job with compliance, and now it's only 56%. So again, these are problems that won't necessarily manifest themselves now. I mean, security problems certainly will, but compliance things are going to be a real issue going down the road, especially, in the context of things like subject access requests, defensible deletion policies and so forth, simply because IT today doesn't have all of our, in the pre-COVID-19 era, didn't have access to all of its corporate data and so couldn't satisfy all of its compliance obligations. Today it has even less of its own data and is going to have even more problems around compliance. We did a survey late last year, and this is less than 3 months before the California Consumer Privacy Act was to go into enforcement. And what we found is at that time, only 30% of organizations were actually compliant with the CCPA, and another 18% were going to be compliant by the end of 2019. So we're looking at, even when enforcement was pending, only half of organizations said that, yeah, we're going to be ready by the end of the year when enforcement goes into effect, which was January 1st of this year. So again, we have a lot of compliance issues to deal with. Even in normal times, those problems are significantly worse in times like these. Also, it's important to note that and here's just an example of fines under the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, or the GDPR. What we found is that regulators tend to be fairly patient early on. And as you can see here, for the first few months, there really weren't many fines. There were only just a small handful of fines. Even in the first 7 months of 2018, after enforcement went into effect, only 9 fines were levied. But in the following 15 months, an additional 177 fines were issued. And I brought this slide in just to show that regulators are probably not going to be very tolerant of an argument that you couldn't comply with various regulations, even in something as severe as the COVID-19 crisis. So when you've got employees that are working from home, generating corporate data, and that data is now more subject to things like data breaches, unintentional loss, malicious insiders, and all the rest, we're going to see this huge upswell of fine, we think, arising from various types of privacy regulations like GDPR and CCPA. And we're going to see that really, bear fruit in the next year or so as this crisis ebbs away and, as things return to at least a semi-normal state. So there are some long-term issues to consider here. Reduced backup means that organizations simply are going to be less able to recover from things like outages or computers breaking, hard disks frying, and so forth. And so there's going to be increased data loss moving forward. And that's going to create problems not only from an operational perspective in organizations, but again, from the more strategic compliance issues. There's less data being archived, and that means organizations are going to be less able to satisfy all of their regulatory and legal obligations to protect and retain data. So if you're in an organization that needs to archive data, and that's just about every organization out there, your inability to archive data is potentially going to come back to bite you at some point when you don't have all the data you need for some sort of a legal action, whether you're being sued or you're the plaintiff or you're just a third party as part of a legal action. You need to have all of the necessary data. The lack of archiving we're finding today is going to be a real issue for a lot of organizations. And also increased security infiltration means that there's a huge potential for data breaches and a loss of compliance. We saw even before this crisis began that one of the new attacks for ransomware authors was to threaten, if somebody chose not to pay the ransom, they'd threaten to expose data on the web. We're going to be seeing that more and more because there are fewer security protections in place today. So expect problems around security, especially for ransomware, to increase fairly rapidly over the next few months. So in summary, the work from home phenomenon really caught most organizations totally off guard. They just weren't expecting this. Some were prepared for it, but most really were not. Organizations can adapt to the new paradigm, and we're seeing that. As they bring their employees up to speed, as they provide more security awareness training, as they implement new controls around compliance, multi-factor authentication, better security, and so forth. But it's going to take some time. And compliance, we believe, is going to be one of the fundamental problems for organizations in the near to midterm. And it's also going to have some very long-term ramifications as well. So at this point, Greg, I'd like to hand over the floor over to you.
Yeah, and no, all that data is definitely going to pertain to kind of what I'm going to be talking about. And my approach, today is going to be kind of like, what can you do to actually stay compliant when all your employees are working from home? It's one thing to know that it is an issue, but how are you going to approach that? Obviously, some of the major pain points that I'd like to discuss is as what Mike was talking about is data compliance, which should be top of mind with the CCPA and GDPR. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, the security issues of working from home. One thing that I've been really enveloped in recently and talking with a lot of my peers in the industry lately, and you can check out more of that stuff at blog.ipswitch.com. We have a great podcast to frag this, and we talk about this all the time. It's something called cyber hygiene. Personal cyber hygiene versus the cyber hygiene in a business environment. And then shadow IT, which we touched upon earlier. People using their own apps and services without IT's knowledge, and how that can become an issue. And then some ways you can alleviate a lot of this is with authentication and moving to the cloud. I know probably 80% of businesses out there have probably already moved to the cloud, or at least in some hybrid cloud environment. But now that everyone's working from home, if you were completely on premise or haven't adopted things like DevOps or continuous integration, or moving to the cloud, you might be in the dark right now or behind. And so it's going to be essential that move into SaaS and iPaaS, integration platform as a service, is going to be really important moving forward for you, especially being able to authenticate who's accessing what data in those environments. But so the first point I want to talk about is obviously compliance. As Mike was saying earlier, we have the GDPR and CCPA, but you got to ask a few questions. The CCPA is loosely based off of the GDPR. I think it went into enforcement in January 1st this year, and I think it's interesting when you saw that graph earlier about how the data authorities and the EU were kind of they were kind of leaning at first, and then after say 6 to 9 months they started handing out the fines. I think you're going to start seeing that with the CCPA. They've kind of said like you have to have everything in place by July, and that's kind of gonna, so you're going to I think the graph is going to look very much similar to fines being handed out. And I also just want to point out that maybe I think, and this happened with the GDPR, it's like, oh, I don't work in the EU, so I don't care about data compliance regulations that, I don't care about the GDPR. And, but, CCPA, maybe you have customers in California, so you're going to be required to kind of apply to those regulations. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of IT folks, and they're always like, oh, well, I don't have any customers in California or in the EU, so I don't care. Or maybe I just work in Ohio or something like that, and my customers are local. But, I always argue it's like, well, California is the fifth largest economy in the world on its own. So if you're going to be growing or expanding, you're going to have to apply by these rules. And even if it's so you're gathering information from a form or something on your website, and that person's in California or at the EU, I mean, you're going to have to abide by those regulations as well. So it's going to be really important to make sure that if you're processing and handling any personal data, whether it's just an email, and that's conservative. We're probably processing way more than that, but let's just say it's just an email. I mean, you got to make sure that that information's encrypted when you're processing and handling that data, and you need to make sure you have the access controls in place to know who has access to that data in your environment, which employees have access to the data, when they have it. And that kind of ties into audits. Auditors are going to be asking about in our current environment when everyone's working from home, auditors will be asking which remote employees have access to the data. Are they saving it on their desktops, and is it exposed to maybe somebody else in their household, or is that data getting lost or stolen? And you need to be able to track that, and that's a lot harder when everyone's working working from home. But the next thing I'd like to talk about is, obviously what ties on the compliance is, questions about your data security. Um, this kind of ties into SLAs and shadow IT and what I was talking about before around data loss. But these are kind of the most important questions to ask in your current environment. Is work being done efficiently and effectively? This can be a huge problem just because, if people aren't able to collaborate or peer-to-peer, then you're going to have issues with shadow IT, as I mentioned earlier. And I know a couple of years ago, a Computer Weekly survey suggested that 81% of respondents in IT had dealt with a security incident due to remote employees, and that kind of matches the data you shared earlier, Michael. And it's a staggering number. The fear of having to deal with a preventable security breach is exasperated in the current business climate, but there are ways to mitigate the risks. You're going to have to approach these issues differently than everyone being in the office. Some security issues you need to consider is, training your employees on the dangers of social engineering, actually testing your employees to ensure they're responding to those security threats the right way. But now there's only so much you can control, which is why the access control and authentication are going to be a huge, huge issue or a huge help in getting rid of advanced persistent threats. But you also need to implement these solutions in a way that doesn't hinder business workflow and continuity. And I'd also like to talk about cyber hygiene a little bit. Now, this is kind of a big thing that we've been talking about on our podcast recently. And next slide, please. Actually, Mike, thank you. Actually, you can go to the next one as well. Perfect, thank you. So something I've been talking about lately with other experts in the industry is this, and I have a frequent guest on our podcast to frag this, Aaron Vishwanath, and he's a psychology of cybersecurity, and there's this idea of cyber hygiene, much like our personal hygiene, which consists of shower and washing our hands, and we know how important that is now currently in the current pandemic, but cyber hygiene has more to do with being proactive about your security online. Phishing scams have been on the rise for years, and people, regardless of training they've received, are still falling for them. And why is that? Why, you continuously train them and you tell them not to click on that clickbait, but they continuously do it. And these are all things IT and security teams need to address and actually be in a fanatic fashion. I don't mean reprimanding individuals for failing to protect themselves, but instead identifying who is at risk and trying to be creative in how you train and change those end users at risk's way of thinking. I'm referring to like email attachments or links in an email, for instance. So it requires a little more finesse than many of us in IT are used to. And that's no fault of our own. We're all technical folk. We just tend to lack in the people skills department, myself included sometimes. This is something I've tried to work on myself for years, but if it isn't something you are good at, you may want to consider hiring a third party to help with this. It's not a bad idea to get outside help if you're having issues with employees constantly falling for the same problems. And there's plenty of companies out there that can help you with that. Just do a Google search. But back to cyber hygiene. Personal security is critical for business security. And I'm always astounded when I hear people that I talk to say that their employees' cyber hygiene is not important to them when they are, and I'm referring to when employees are like actually off the clock. This is so far from the truth. I mean, it can't be stressed enough. The one thing I like to talk about is, passwords to get this point across. Passwords are the weakest link in security, and I'm willing to bet your users are probably using the same passwords at home that they use at work. And, what if their Gmail gets hacked? Hackers are going to take that personal information. They're going to use that to try to access your business network. And you don't need me to go into why that's bad. You're already going to have a data security breach and compliance issue off the bat. So you need to consider, you want to test what precautions employees take to protect themselves at work and when they aren't working. We do a mandatory poll. I like to suggest you do a mandatory poll, work with your HR team to get a better handle on this. You'd be surprised at how many loopholes are in your infrastructure that may pop up in your face when you actually do a poll. You'd be like, oh my God, these, yeah, they're practicing good security practices at work, but when they go home, I mean, they're clicking on everything. They have malware all over their personal devices. And then they're accessing business applications and services on their web browser on a, computer that has a has a backdoor remote desktop, worm in it, and that obviously that's already a compliance issue and a data security breach in itself. So this will lead to better training and implementation, doing a poll, understanding, kind of your kind of understand your risk assessment throughout the what I call increased perimeter defenses now that everyone's working from home. Before it was easier because everything was confined within the office space or, your remote offices, whatnot. But now it's because everyone's working from home, that perimeter defense has become a huge issue. And, the next thing I kind of like to talk about that will kind of help, with this too is a little thing about work culture. It isn't IT's issue per se, but it is essential when it comes to end user trust. And it definitely comes from the C-suite down. But if executives aren't promoting a healthy and collaborative environment, then it's going to hurt your efforts in trying to corral employees to collaborate in an effective manner. And obviously that leads to, shadow IT. One of the biggest issues with remote workforces is when employees take matters into their own hands and they can't get the job done efficiently. Most of the time, it's usually lack of visibility on the IT side and a lack of transparency from your end users. So are you getting a lot of the same tickets about apps and services? That might mean, maybe you should look at that app or service and why are they having issues with that and trying to see what they want to use. But also since employees are on their own networks and many times their own devices right now, you need to think about all the ways your business data is going to pass through less secure home networks. And this is without the proper VPNs, firewalls, or antivirus in place. Then on the application layer, do you know what apps and services your employees are actually using? Are they transferring data in an ad hoc way where sensitive data could be touching untested open APIs or third-party plugins? I know a couple of years ago, for instance, British Airways was hacked through a third-party plugin, and it was a supply chain attack on the third-party plugin, which got access to data that was going through their e-commerce web forms. And millions of people were exposed to this, and they didn't get off the hook. They were one of the first companies to get a huge GDPR fine. So you don't want to be like that. You need to know what's in your stack, even if it's a API or third-party plugin. That's going to be super important. Also, you got to consider, if you were, audited right now, would you be able to report on who or what services and who has access to that data? And that kind of ties into the authentication part of this. Passwords, as most of us can attest to, are no longer enough to, secure your business data. You start considering things like single sign-on and multi-factor authentication, making sure that's implemented, just so the people accessing your apps and services are who they say you are. You will also need to have logs of all your employees accessing these systems remotely in case there is a breach, because once the investigation happens, they're going to want to know, hey, were you actually securing this data? Did you know who had access? Was it encrypted? All that. And then last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about, moving to the cloud. As I said earlier, I think most of us are probably in some form of hybrid cloud environment, but if you're not, you probably have struggled to deal with a remote workforce more than, say, people who have integrated. It's great to have, solutions like something that's SaaS based or integrated platform as a service, which I like to call iPaaS. And because you can kind of integrate, single sign-on and multi-factor authentication, it's kind of, one password to rule them all, and you can have access to everything else, which is, great for business continuity and integration, especially and you may not work in a fully DevOps environment, but the continuous integration aspect of that is going to be super important to make sure employees are able to work quickly and effectively. And that in that in stride will get rid of shadow IT if everything is in the cloud. But also you need to consider just because it's in the cloud, it doesn't mean it's compliant. I know a lot of cloud providers like to take a limited responsibility for your data security. So, somewhat, you gotta understand what's, in your cloud stack, how it connects to your business infrastructure, and how your employees are actually accessing those apps and services. And then, I have, that's pretty much, that's pretty much my spiel today about, how you can, secure your stuff, secure yourself, your employees, making sure that they're doing the right thing, not at, not only at work, but at home. So you're, making sure you got to train these people. But I have a bunch of podcasts you guys can check out. Why cyber hygiene is so important. That's a great one. And also, check out, we have some tips on multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, and how you can implement that. And also check out, we also have a tool called MoveIt, Manage File Transfer, that you can also check out, which helps with, making sure your data is encrypted, as opposed to using something like a Dropbox or a Google Drive, where, you don't have the access controls or, the transparency you need to, report on if something gets accessed by, a malicious insider or an advanced persistent threat gets that data, or there's data loss or anything like that. So definitely check out these resources to kind of learn more about how you can protect yourself and your employees.
Very good. Well, Greg, thank you so much. Great presentation. Here's our contact information, and I'd like to thank everybody who took the time out to hear us today. And if you do have any questions, you can contact Greg or I, and we will get ready answers to your questions. Thank you once again.